Hi, Misha here, and this is a bit of an addendum. Just released the big FN FAL L1A1 deep dive rifle guide video, and this one is going to be a bit of FAQ and Q&As from some live streams and Patreon questions, kind of answering them directly. I thought about putting these in the big video, but I was afraid they would just get lost in the sauce, and I wanted to give justice to what people asked me. Some of it will be redundant, a few corrections, and really just some trivia things I kind of felt. So it's just going to be little snippets throughout this video. I'll probably record this over a few days as things come to mind and as people ask questions. So with that, yeah, if you'd like to help support the channel and also get your questions asked and answered, you can always support on Patreon, link below, or check out our live streams. I'll be honest, I kind of just do them when I feel like them, but I am trying to make Thursday night at least one regular night. But we'll see how it goes as we get into 2024, right? And if you haven't seen the big video, I don't know, one evening when it's cold this winter, you got nothing else to do, maybe you're sick at home with some chicken noodle soup, yeah, check it out. I love the FAL and have had a long love affair with it. It actually predates even my enjoyment of the Kalashnikov, as does this gun here. And I figured we'd start here with the Austrian STG58 to answer a few questions, talk about a few things. In a live stream, I was asked what I thought was the best, finest made FAL. And when I was thinking about military guns, and they're all made really well, there wasn't like a markedly worse one. Some guns, like the British, had a few simplified lightning cuts, this and that for mass production. But it's hard to say that the Austrian STG58 isn't among the nicest made. And this would include the original Steyr cold hammer forged barrels. Interestingly though, they were not chrome lined. In fact, the majority did not even have chrome chambers. But they were just known for very good accuracy, and having a folding light bipod certainly helped. And this was an improved bipod design, even a slightly improved stamped handguard design, plus an improved gas valve, gas regulator, and the Stoll flash hider certainly was unique and certainly fulfilled their jobs well, and their unique pattern of stock saved weight. So I really do think these were really among the best, and since they were never really exported from Austria, at least until we got the kits, when you bought the parts kits, they tended to be in the best condition. Now the only downside, as I discussed in the full video, there were no Austrian made semi-autos. But the good news is, Dave, DS Arms, obtained the tooling, blueprints, and know-how from Steyr, and the earlier receivers were forged and made for DS Arms by LMT, so a DS receiver is the way to go. Very high quality, really almost as good as the original Steyr, and just fits a STG58 kit oh so very well. Makes a great build. And while this gun was not my first FAL build, the specific gun, an STG58 was the first build that actually J-Ro's father helped me with long ago. Another thing, I put the alloy so-called paratrooper mag in this gun. Why is that? I only have a few of these mags, but boy are they light compared to the steel. Where do they come from? Well, yeah, paratrooper tends to be the name. That would seem logical because of the weight. As I mentioned in video 1, some source them in West Germany, but according to the big FAL book, these are made in Austria. And that would actually make sense to save some weight on the mags, because this here gun, while it is great, is among the heaviest FAL variants. Mostly because of the bipod and handguard combo, and just overall beefy construction. And we're not talking pounds heavier, just, a few ounces heavier. So I could see them saving weight with these mags. On the other hand, West Germany had an interest in alloy mags with the G3 too, so yeah. I haven't really researched it, if I'm being honest. I'm sorry. But those are the possible things. But I do often put these mags with my paratrooper. But I do keep them in a well-worn and loved 2-cell Austrian pouch. I've got a lot of these pouches anyway. And for what it's worth, the sling used on the 58 was a modified, really just repurposed K98 Mauser sling because, well, Austria had a bunch of these after World War II. So, yeah, why not make use of them? Perfectly good sling. I just really like this gun. So that was maybe the nicest military gun. But what about what I consider to be the nicest semi-automatic available in the USA? Now, I don't mean one built by a custom builder. Some of those are just gorgeous. I've seen some West German BGS builds and early T-48 faux clone copies that are just amazing. Production guns you could grab. And yeah, I know it's a little cliche with me, but I really do like the Argentine FMAP, FSL, or LSR, Spanish versus English. Now, this is just neck and neck with the Belgian and the Brazilian guns. Do not get me wrong. I couldn't, in all honesty, say objectively one's better than the other. But here is my opinion. Comparing with the FN 50.00 guns, the ones on the Type 3 receivers, not the Type 2s, but the Type 3s, so the later imports, the ones you mostly see. They're on cast receivers. This is still on a forged receiver. Look, the FN cast receiver was a very good, very solid receiver. But even FN says they don't have the life expectancy of a forged. Now, a Type 3 in general is stronger than a Type 1, Type 2, just because of not having all the cuts. But when you consider cast versus forged, also, the FN guns from the era didn't have marked gas adjustment knobs or the 2-position regulator plug in the front. So, few downsides there. Just a few economies that FN made with the LAR, as they called it in the 80s. And the only real detraction I can say about the Argentine gun is while it has a flash hider bayonet lug device, it does not have the 22mm grenade ring or the internal threading for a blank fire device. And while most of them had bipod cut barrels and handguards, they often did not come with bipods, but of course you could easily put one on. Now all of that, and it was a lot cheaper than a Belgian gun. And frankly, a lot rarer too. So it's kind of a double win. More Belgians came in and they sold then and sold today for more money. This gun's a rarer gun, as I said in video 1. Under 1,500 pre-bands came in, and really only about 4,000 transitional post-band guns in 93, 94 too. So very small numbers. So what about comparing it with the Brazilian MBEL? Being objective, there is really not a better gun, MBEL versus FMAP at this point. Both are on forged Type 3 receivers. Both have kind of the standard barrel look and all that stuff, polymer furniture. So it really just comes down to what you like, what you appreciate. And for me, I like the finish on the Argentinian gun a little better. It also seems a little bit thicker paint than the Brazilian. A little bit more durable. Again, I am splitting hairs. I know this. And I also like the Argentine furniture. It's more of that kind of matte gray green, almost black, that you saw beginning in the 60s with FN. I like the matte texture. It's just less slippery. It also doesn't show scuffs and scratches as much as the shinier stuff that FN and MBO would later use. And it feels more of a military furniture. Now, yes, I know that the military also had the shiny guns, but I like it a little bit more, including with the carry handle being in that finish. It's just a little bit more appealing to me. Likewise, I like the tall sights. Now, as I pointed out in the first video, the National Arms guns had the short sights, and the later Type 4 kits we got had the short sights. But the Arms Corps, and I believe the imported guns too had the tall. I like this. I know that the short are better objectively, but I like the open ear style and the taller, and it's just a little bit distinctive, if you know what I mean. I don't know. I like the aesthetics of these, and for a long time, even the MBELs, the SAR-48s, sold for more. I think what hurt the FMAP guns were the post bands. Now you can tell a pre from a post by the serial. You can also tell by the marking or lack thereof inside the magwell. If you see Saclata in there, it's a post 1989 gun, but for anyone that still matters in a band state, if they still count it, they are pre-1994. So that may matter, not as much today as it used to, but yeah. I think they're neat, and maybe I was just being a little quirky and different. And the only kind of non-military thing, aside from just being semi-only, is the flash hider. But of course, it unscrews, and you can screw a standard one on if you so choose. But I would advise you, if you get one, be careful about doing that. I've seen some collectors that actually go out of their way to get the Argentinian muzzle device, because it is unique. Also, the upper and lower, the fitment of the lower is just slightly different. There's a pin in a slightly different location. Little bit difference there. But yeah, I think that was the best option if you wanted a semi-auto back in the day. But again, totally my take. What's yours? Let's discuss. While the FSL's on the table, another question that I've been asked over the years: can I disassemble the paratrooper? Can we look inside? Sure, why not? Let's do that. First, the standard model. I know you know how these come apart, but yay, just let's be complete. With the original vertical lever, you pull it back towards the butt. With the newer horizontal, you press up. Now, it's not going to spring open. These are pretty well fitted, at least an FAL should be, because you don't want them popping open in recoil. And since we're on YouTube now, and they don't really like gunsmithing or disassembly, be right back. Here it is open, and from this point on, you'll just want to try to use my hand here. Use your handle and push your bolt group out. That's our rat tail that fits in our buttstock we've talked about. And you definitely don't want to take the spring out. You can pull the bolt group out without removing the top cover, but it just slides right off. It's on simple guide rails. And then for our bolt and carrier, to separate them, you do like that, and then you just press in on the back. I'm going to set you down for a second, of the firing pin, and they pop right off. There's a couple of different styles of firing pin and extractors, early and late. This is pretty well standard. Little rat tail with the spring. Your main spring is in your stock. You really shouldn't and even cannot disassemble it without the right tool. Even then, yeah, it can be a challenge. So yeah, that's the standard one and the standard receiver. We'll leave it open to compare. Again, your charging handle doesn't come out. If you need to remove it, there's a small pin you drive out and then you separate the block and it comes off. But luckily it locks in forward. It's not going to flop around on you. Our locking shoulder, all that good stuff. So what about the paratrooper? Same lever on the side. So disassembly starts off identical. And once you open it, you'll notice there's no tail, no springs, nothing kind of coming out at you. So we'll need to actuate our handle to get this started. Notice it's coming off as a whole piece. And the whole thing comes out as a complete packet, spring and all. What holds it together? Well, you've got a little dimple or lip in the front. That's really it. Of course, the back has a plate. So to further separate these, you just press slightly back and down, and it comes out. It doesn't come flying out at you, but it does separate. The carrier is a little bit taller to make room for this, or at least it's more exposed, and we have our main spring system here. And inside it, you'll notice it's kind of nested together. Just tilt it up and the small spring will come out. These are actually two springs joined together with a small guide rod that fit inside the main one, and these all fit inside the carrier. And then there's another fixed guide rod back here on the top cover. So as you can tell, it's all very specific. And that also means the receiver is specific too. Our standard receiver is at the gas piston area right there. And this is our handle. The rails come almost all the way to the front. With our para, obviously the rails stop short to let this lock in. And for that nose, we have this circular machined area here. That's just for the special top cover. And again, the FN paras do not have anything machined here. At least my Argentinian has the donut spacer. Of course, your lower is different. There's a few different styles of lower too. And we looked at the latch, the locking tab, the button underneath. Your FN guns, your Brazilian guns, your Argentine guns will have it. Your DS arms, US made folding stocks, don't. I can understand why they installed it in the military guns just as a double security, but also why they removed it for the US production. Because really just the friction fit of pressing down like a Galil stock really should be enough. But ever since I learned about the paratroopers early on, I just thought this change in recoil mechanism was cool and had to have one. My first was actually a DS Arms STG58C, and then later I found this one. Pretty neat. The only really downside is it is a stiffer action to charge because you're compressing 3 springs at once, 2.5 at the least. But they do work very well. When reassembling, always make sure your hammer is cocked back. And in some ways, as long as you're careful, I actually find the paratrooper a little easier to reinstall. I also find that with FALs, because of the way the bolt and bolt carrier work, turning it vertical. It kind of lets everything fall into place better. If you need to clean your gas piston, you just rotate this and everything neatly pulls out. And if you need to go further, there's one screw that holds your handguards on, and the gas tube itself underneath sits pretty loose. The only difference is on the STG58, it's a short welded thing. So yeah, easy as can be. While we have the para out, another question that I was asked on the live stream, which I thought was the better, more durable rear sight. And if it's durability, it's this style, the so-called Holland rear sight. You have very beefy protective ears, but they are quite slim. And while it's windage adjustable, it's got a set range at 250, fudge it to 300 meters. Just a simple fixed peep, doesn't move, and it has protectors, and these would all be on the low side. This one has the somewhat later parasight, has good protectors, a little bit simplified, and you have two positions, 150 and a 250 meter. So still quite good, still much stiffer than your standard one, but a little bit more fiddly. So I just find this one far fewer things to move and go wrong. Also, it's just a smaller, slimmer sight, which kind of lessens its chances of getting hit. Both are really good, dependable sights, and much more out of the way than the standard one. But yeah, someone asked, and so that's my pick. Another neat aspect of this Congo version, it has the kind of earlier style, large vent hole handguards. Later on, they would go to smaller ones. These are very 1960s, early FN pattern style. These are Argentine handguards, and of course they match with the non-bipod cut barrel. But this honestly made me almost want to do like a M1 clone. You know, we think of the C1, C1A1 as having the stripper clips, but actually some earlier guns like the M1 also had the cutback top cover. They could be topped off with clips, but that would quickly go away. A lot of times those guns would have the polymer handguard, but then still have the older style wood stock. I think doing one of those would be kind of a cool transitional, say early 60s build. Just that I mentioned that. I think it's neat. The Falklands War. Yes, both sides used the FAL, or at least a variant. The British forces had the L1A1 SLR, and the Argentinian forces had their FAL. Both sides also used high power derivatives. Heck, both sides even used similar submachine guns on some level, although they would use different light machine guns. The British had the L4A1 Bren, and the Argentines would have the FAP, the FAP, the Fallow. So, one difference there. So the question was, who had the better FAL in that war? Hard to say. Both fired 7.62 NATO, both were made in military factories, both were made under license. You know, each had some features. Obviously, the majority of the Argentine guns that had the 21-inch barrel just had this one on the table, so yeah, here it is. And they could have had the tall or the short sights. I think most still had the tall, but, you know, they had some others. But the big difference was in the fire control group. Your British guns were safe, semi-auto only. Your Argentinian guns would have a three-way selector, so they had automatic fire. This could be a blessing or a curse, just depending, but many soldiers at the time felt it was nice to have the full auto option in case of a position being overrun, so on and so forth. So much so that some British soldiers captured Argentinian FALs and would carry them in the field. Now, the British guns could take Argentine metric mags as well as their own inch mags, but of course, the Argentine metric guns could not take the British mags. When it comes to mags, the British had better mags. However, it seems like on average, the Argentinians would issue more mags per gun than the British. Just kind of one of those things. The Argentine guns had a last round hold open, automatic. The British did not. But this time, your British would mostly have the mirror furniture, so very much like the Argentines. One thing I would give the L1A1 credit for is there were 4 different lengths of butt plate, meaning that to a certain degree they could be tailored to better fit the soldier's arm length, general height. So that was a small advantage. On the other hand, it's a plastic butt, whereas your Argentine gun would have a rubber butt. Probably a little bit nicer when it comes to that. You have carry handles on both. Personally, I think the British is a little bit nicer, a little bit bigger. Of course, the British guns had folding charging handles. Both had adjustable gas systems. The British had a more traditional flash hider. In fact, the British guns were about 45 inches overall, whereas the Argentine guns were about 43. But weight-wise, they're about the same. I do like the change lever on the British a little more. It's a little larger, a little easier to get to. On the other hand, they were still using the older style takedown. On the other hand, they had a folding rear sight for use with the suit optic. Folding handle too to not poke into your side. And while they didn't have a last round hull open, they did have a more ergonomic, easier to reach mag catch. And they had a folding trigger guard, which probably wasn't very useful in the Falklands, but just thought I'd point that out. On the other hand, there was no provision to mount a bipod, whereas some of the Argentinian guns could have that. And not that it matters, but the Argentinian guns had a small emergency cleaning kit in the pistol grip, and because of that folding trigger guard, the British guns did not, unless they still had the old style walnut wood buttstock. Then they could. I don't know. They were so very, very close. The major difference was full auto, semi-auto safe, or semi-auto safe fire modes. That would be more important if the FAL was at least a halfway practical gun in full auto. It really wasn't. But both are very combat-proven weapons and served quite well. So I think it just kind of comes down to personal preference. And I love both, but for very, very different reasons. Moving on with the questions. I was asked in the live stream, what's the rarest FAL variant? I don't know, but I can tell you what it's not. It's not the G series FAL. I don't have a G series, probably never will, but this is basically what they were. This style of gun. They're very famous because of the court case that lasts for years and the fact that they were grandfathered in. Now, the G-Series guns were originally select fire. They were converted to semi-only by Parker Hale in the UK, who also did some construction work for the L1A1s. And they were brought over here, and they were sold, and then they were recalled, and then they were eventually given back to their owners because they were bought under good faith. Yeah, they sell for so much because they're famous. Now, are they FN guns? Yes. Were they original military guns? Yes. But today, they're asking $15,000, give or take, for them. There are 1,836 in this country. That's not a small number. It's actually quite a large number. Fewer FN 50.63s came in, under 1,400 of those. And far fewer Argentine paratroopers came in of anything else. Fewer of these British L1A1s came in. No one knows for sure how many of these came in. 200's been said, but that seems like an awfully low number. I think it was probably a little more, maybe 300 or 400, just based on how many you see. Still, though, far fewer of these than the G series. And beyond that, this is just as an authentic a military gun as a G series. Plus, as you can tell, they're actual surplus guns that saw combat, wear and tear. That's neat to me. And if you want something that's like a G series, just get yourself like a West German G1 kit, build it on a good receiver, and bada boom, bada bang, there you go. But beyond that, there are so many guns that are in such small numbers. For example, there were some FN Type 2 semi-autos. Very few came in the 70s that were available. Fewer than 1,800, I bet. Heck, there were some even Sear cut FN guns imported by Steyr in the 70s that have been grandfathered in. So if you want an FN Sear cut gun, you don't want a British, look for one of those Steyr guns. Yeah, they sell for a little bit of a premium, but nothing like a G series. Just saying. The Poirier L1A1As, 158 of those came in. I think I've kind of made my point. Tons of guns are rarer than the G series. Hey, if you've got the money and you want a G series, go for it. But don't think you're getting, by the numbers, the rarest gun ever imported. It's just not the case. Now, were they the first FALs? Yeah, basically. Aside from maybe a few random things. Really, importation didn't explode until the 1980s. But, yeah, I just had to mention that for what it's worth. Let's change it up a bit and talk Israelis. Had a few questions about these. First, if I want an Israeli FAL, what are my options? Were there any new production guns? In other words, new receivers, new barrels, all new parts. In a word, no. Now, maybe there's a couple that came in. I really hesitate to say never, ever, ever. But pretty much all we got in the 80s and 90s, on and on, were original parts built on the new production semi-automatic receivers. So if someone wants absolutely mint condition guns, this might be problematic. But if you're a military surplus collector, these are cool because they've been there, they've done that. Or at least some of the parts have. And in the 80s, there were some Onyx guns. Most were the Arms Corps guns. And then, as we talked about in the first video, Springfield built some heavy barrels in the US on M-Bell receivers because they were doing the M-Bell guns. Now, there were a few SBLs, Stuckner Brothers Limited receivers, that were put on with heavy barrel kits, but they seem pretty few and far between. Most you find are the light barrels, but everywhere else, mostly you find the heavy barrels. The kits have always been more common. In fact, if you look for an FALO kit in America, chances are it's Israeli. So, that's not a bad thing, though. And what I really like about these is they're examples of early 1955 pattern guns. This is why I said in video 1, they're metric, but they're kind of a different type of metric. The length of the gas piston and the gas plug is a little bit different. Of course, you have the early lugged barrel. That's certainly different. Even the threading for the barrels was the earlier style. And of course, they have the tall rear sights. Your light barrel will have a 600 meter. Your heavy barrel has the slightly longer 700 meter. The heavy barrels have a flash hider. And the light barrels can have a lug. They can have a lug and a combo device, or they can just have a combo device. Either one can have the Israeli style cast gas block or the FN style open ear. And most you find will have the later style furniture, but you could always get lucky and get an earlier type 2. And the Israeli parts are a little different. For example, there's a hole in the mag catch, and the bolt release is a slightly different shape. More interestingly, the carry handle is of a different style, especially the Israeli one. And of course, your charging handle has the forward assist built in, which corresponds with the bolt carrier. So, well, pros and cons. With the heavy barrel, the Springfield guns, okay, they were assembled here and they're on an M-bell receiver, which is not really the right receiver. And it doesn't quite match up with the rear here of the lower. Fun fact though, the FN 50.41 and 50.42 guns are also like this. Even though the FN guns are on Type 3 receivers, they have the earlier style lower. Not sure why. And these, while they're in good shape, do have a little bit more wear on a lot of the parts. A lot of times they will be missing the donut here. I've never seen a heavy in military service that had both. It seems like they always just had the one, but sometimes the semi-autos can be missing that. Also, a lot of times, for whatever reason, the limiter up here is missing. Allowing these to spin the full way is just held in with a pin. So if you get one, this piece here should be here. I think some people remove it so they can take off the bipod, but I've always found the better way is just use the big screw and take it off that way. For what it's worth. So what about the SBL guns? Generally, these seem to be built from very nice condition parts, either newly made parts that were never issued or just nicely refurbished ones. These two can be missing the donuts. This one has both. Some can have one. Either way is really correct, but I just put both on mine. Why not? I do like this style of handguard. And I actually do like the IMI gas block. This is a correct sling. The receivers are a little odd. There are several different ways that SBL cut these out. None of them are exactly Type 1 or Type 2, Type 3. Israeli guns should have all been Type 1. This one they've done the cutout back here, but the front is a little off. Not 100%, but a little bit off. So if you get an SBL, just see what kind of receiver cut you get. They're all the same. Again, they started off as FN forgings, but they were incomplete, which is actually how SBL was able to finish them off as semi-auto. As I mentioned in the first video, the rivets for the ejector block are a little fugly. They work fine, but if you look to buy one and you see the weird rivets for the block, don't be turned off. That's correct. Again, these were built as budget options, just like the M-Bell SAR-48s were. In both instances, the companies were trying to compete with FN, and I would say they both succeeded. And since the Israelis used the FAL very heavily for 20 years, I love the history here. I'm not getting into the politics, but you can't deny these have history, because a lot of the nations that got the FAL just, issued it around, but never really used it in combat. For example, Austria. But yeah, these are your only options for an import. And of course, you can always find Israeli kits assembled on receivers in the US. That's another thing. Let's keep on with the heavy barrel talk and questions and move back to Argentina, because along with Israel, it was one of the few other nations that issued these and actually used them, namely in the Falklands War, and one of the very few to manufacture. In fact, really only, if I'm thinking right, Argentina and Belgium made these en masse. Brazil and South Africa made some heavy barrels, but it doesn't seem like they made very, very many at all. And it doesn't even seem like the Belgian military issued them much, or at least used them in any kind of combat. Is, well, kind of obvious. So most of the ones that Belgium made went to Israel and would be of the Israeli pattern. So these are the two metrics that you could say saw combat. And definitely the bipod that comes with the Argentinian gun is a beast. It has a rotation to it. It's almost got like a piston system. It is solid. The Israeli bipod is fine. It's lighter. But this is a hell of a bipod. And you have more exposed barrel, which in theory might cool a little bit faster. Similar tall sights. Very similar handguards to Belgian. Always thought the kind of slab side carry handle was cool. Very Belgian-esque. Pretty standard rear sight. And unlike the FN semi-auto heavies that came in, this actually has a lower that matches its upper. But it has fewer distinctive features compared to the Israeli heavy barrel. For example, it doesn't have that flip-up butt plate. It's got the standard wide Argentine release. So the lower is pretty standard, even this part of the receiver. So your differences are basically in your barrel assembly. These Argentine heavies are rare. I really wish I knew a number, but there's certainly fewer in the US than the FN guns. And I think they're more interesting and they're cool. Now, interestingly, they do have somewhat shinier stock, but a shinier pistol grip. And I thought that was odd, that they have kind of the glossy grip. But it's correct. I investigated quite a bit. Why these had a shiny pistol grip, I will probably never ever know. And of course they have the more traditional selector versus the kind of special one we see on the Israeli. Two other nations manufactured heavy barrel FALOs, but only really one used them in combat. And now we return to Lithgow, Australia, who manufactured the L2A1, and of course, even before that, Canada, who manufactured the C2, and really they work together, and it shows. The original C2 and the L2A1 are very, very similar, including this tangent sight, which actually is adjustable up to 1,000 meters, which might be a tad optimistic, but there it is. Now, when Canada went to the C2A1, they went to an enlarged rotary disc, somewhat like the C1A1, which makes sense to have kind of a consummate sight picture. But Australia, who made these from roughly 1962 to 1982, but the bulk made in the first decade, they made about 10,000. They kept on with the initial pattern, and there was never like an L2A2. And we've already talked a lot about it, including this very unique handguard assembly, which I think in practical terms does make this a lighter gun. Of course, the L2A1 and C2 had the full change lever. And a question that was asked was, is this legal? Absolutely, 100%. Since this is not the receiver, the upper is the receiver on any FAL, the lower is a trigger frame. It's fine to have this selector. In fact, you don't even have to modify the trigger group. If you leave it in this position, you're just going to get one shot off, and then you're going to have hammer follow, and that's it. And this has been upheld time and time again. Unfortunately, more than once, FFL dealers who receive various FALs in will call the ATF thinking they have an illegal full auto. And every time they do, the ATF comes back saying it's fine. But just wanted to point this out. Unlike the L1A1, you do have 3 positions, and of course that goes for most of your metrics. You do have a unique kind of crooked forward carry handle. Unlike with the metrics that actually faces forward, this still faces rear, but it's just pushed forward a bit. And you still have a very heavy duty barrel and all that. And of course these had their own extended 30 round box mag, which are pretty uncommon today. And that's a good spot to talk about magazines. Sorry, YouTube doesn't like me taking mags in and out, so gotta do that off camera. Here's our standard L2A1 30 round mag. the C2, C281 would use the same type. It is of course the inch pattern, and it is straight. Often confused for it is the British L4A1 mag, used in their L4A1 Bren guns. Basically Bren's reworked for 7.62 NATO. This has a curve, but the big difference is, whereas this attaches on the bottom and pushes up, because this goes to a Bren gun, it's actually meant to be gravity assisted in its feed. Which means while it will fit in L1A1 or even an L2, the spring is a little bit weaker, and the curve can give a little bit more resistance, so you might have feeding issues. You know what though, that said, even the straight 30 round mags often had that second round failure. It's just hard to get a mag this size to have a spring strong enough to push the rounds from first to last. It really even continued on with some of the metric mags, and here's a metric 30. These metric 30s are a lot more common than the inch 30s. You'll see them coming out of South Africa, of course Belgium, and Argentina, and a few others. Interestingly, Israel did not use these. They used 20s, but they're pretty well standard metric, and they too are straight. Stronger spring in this one. So those are your 30 round mag flavors. Here's the metric 30 in the L2. They'll fit, but they are a little bit loose and wobbly, some guns more than others. And here's the L4 mag in the L1A1, and there are even a few soldier pictures of them doing this. I mean, it could be done. They were both in the field at the same time. And I had to bring the L1A1 back out because we had a very specific question from a supporter about Malaysia. He asked about Malaysian use of the FAL. Specifically, yes, they adopted the L1A1 SLR. In 1965, the Malaysian Navy was the first to go to the FAL, the L1A1, the SLR, followed in 1968 by the Malaysian Army, and also the police obtained some as well. And what I've read, which is honestly very little, it seems like they were British guns. But then again, we do start to see a bunch of mixing and matching, because the whole idea was sharing of parts between Canada, England, Australia, and the rest. And the Malaysian guns served for a very long time and were eventually replaced by the HK-33, which we eventually got those kits here. They were also replaced in part by the Beretta AR-70, which we got some of those kits as well. So kind of neat. Not a whole lot to be said there, but they did serve. They were around. It's a thing. And it's a bit of bonus material. Let's talk about New Zealand. We have a little more concrete data there. They decided to go with the SLR in September of 1958, and right as Lithgow was setting up production, they would sign a contract with them, and the first guns would be delivered from Australia to New Zealand in 1960. And between that time and 1965, they would receive 15,000 L1A1 semi-automatic types and a handful of L2A1s. But they really weren't impressed with the L2. For the most part, like the British, they used the L4A1. They technically had both, but they preferred the L4, and that seems like it was in service longer. And just as in Australia, New Zealand would replace their FALs with a variant of the Steyr AUG beginning in 1988. Kind of find that interesting. With these both on the table, I wanted to address the lightning cut. Both are very, very similar. And of course, this is a DS, a Australian pattern, But they actually did it justice. They did it right. Because the lightning cut on an Aussie is ever so slightly different than a lightning cut on a British. The British skipped just a couple of machining steps because they plan to make a bunch of these. And the Australians, taking kind of a cue from Canada, did slightly nicer, more even lightning cuts for whatever that's worth. Canadian guns are very similar, except they do have a cutout on the side for a thumb for using the charger system. Just thought I'd point that out. Another thing that came up in conversation, another Lithgow variant that's quite interesting, is the L1A1F1. Yeah, I know. This was made for shorter stature people. I think the first customers were in Papua New Guinea, and some were issued to soldiers in Australia. In fact, one of the folks in our live chat said that when he was in 1994, they still had some L1A1F1s knocking about, and he got to fire one, so that's pretty cool. And I didn't know this until just kind of looking, but in 1984, some F1s were also transferred to the Hong Kong police, which of course at that time was still under Commonwealth jurisdiction, English jurisdiction. They would remain there for another decade and some change. Now the F1 was pretty simple. As I've talked about, there were different lengths of buttstock. So with the F1, Lithgow would put on the short stock. That was pretty normal. What was different, they would actually make a special flash hider that was shorter. And between the shorter flash hider and the shorter stock, these were about 2 1/4 inches overall shorter, which is a little funny to me because it's basically returning the L1A1 to the same overall length as a metric FAL. Actually, maybe just a teensy hair shorter, but 43 inches give or take. I don't know. I find that kind of odd. Lithgow did a few other experiments. They actually did a couple of prototype bullpups. And I only mention that because of them eventually going to the Steyr AUG, the F88 and F90 bullpup. So kind of shows that inclination. I mean, heck, even Britain went to a bullpup. But unfortunately, instead of going to the AUG variant, as they should have done, they did the Enfield L85A1. And oh boy, what a thing that was. But that's out of the scope of this here video. But I wanted to answer the Malaysian question, throw in the New Zealand, and also mention the F1 because, again, that came up in conversation, and it is a cool variant. Another question, or rather request, could I compare side by side the FN FAL metric mag and the Argentine Navy's FN49 7.62 NATO mag? Sure. Should have done that in the beginning, but really didn't. Both are 20 rounders. Both are steel. As you see, the 49 mag is significantly longer. I'd say roughly an inch. And if you put them on top of each other, it's longer front to back as well by at least a good ½ inch. They're also dimensionally different on the top. This will be hard for me to show you. Give me a sec. As you can see, hopefully, they're very different. The feed lips are in very different locations. The follower comes up much higher on the 49 mag. They're just very, very different patterns. I think we're really starting to see, if you look at the back, they're also very different. And of course the front latch is also very different. Metric. The 49. Very, very big lug there. It's pretty clear when you have them side by side why they really couldn't make the FN49 take FAL mags. At least not reliably. They probably tried, but it just wasn't in the cards. Very heavy duty mag. Again, just a bigger mag. Luckily it's not so heavy it just hurt my foot, which it did not. Can you tell I've been at this a while? I'm getting tired. Don't worry, it landed on my foot and then carpet. So, but yeah, I think it is very clear why these are just not interchangeable. But yeah, I was asked, so I delivered, folks. Now, I think these might have been able to be topped off by FN stripper clip guides, if memory serves, excuse me. Could be wrong on that. Yeah. Moving on with questions, I was asked, why are there not as many variants of the HKG3 as the FN FAL? I'm not going to make this into a G3 versus FAL discussion, no. I will say, though, that the G3 came onto the market roughly a decade after. And, of course, it came from Spain and West Germany. A little different from coming from Belgium, Fabrique Nationale, given the politics and, honestly, production abilities post-Cold War. Also, yes, over 40 nations adopted or at least used the G3 in some variety, but over 90 used the FN FAL. So it was there first, it spread more. I also have to think it's because FN was willing to change the design, and of course it benefited from almost becoming the standard rifle of NATO, and it had the whole Allied Rifle Commission. The G3, on the other hand, it was what West Germany went to when the G1 didn't work out, and it was meant to be economical. Not that it was a bad gun, I'm not saying that, but this is a stamped and welded gun. This is an old school machined metal, wood, later polymer gun. There's just a certain amount of elegance that the FAL had, the G3 didn't. But it's neither here nor there. And there are variants of the G3. Of course, you have the original version with wood furniture, the later polymer version. You have the collapsing stock. You have the standard stock. You've got the skinny handguard, the wide. And of course, you have the different barrel lengths. Either the 18-inch or the 12.5. G3, G3K. I also have to think that maybe HK had a little tighter control when other nations, like say POF or MKE, made guns, what they let them do. When guns were made in other countries like Argentina, they were kind of free to do their thing. I don't know, but it's true. There are a number of variations of the G3. But if you really get into it, there are tons of variations of the FAL, and I don't even have close to any of them. In our conversations, the Venezuelan, the Colombian models were brought up. As you see, I don't even have a Brazilian as such. And so on and so forth. They really are neat, and especially when you get to the early evolutions from the 50s through the early 60s. By the 70s, they were kind of standardized. But, yeah, I don't know. But it's just one of those things. But it is what kind of keeps collecting the FAL more interesting to me. When it comes to the G3, I feel rather well served having just this one gun plus a SEPMI. I've got the collapsing stock for it. I can swap them in and out. There are definite benefits to it, that's for sure. Another question I was asked, it's a personal question. What's my favorite .308 battle rifle to shoot? And I had to think about it for a minute, and then I came up with the Beretta BM59. Now, I'm not saying this is the best. No. Just what I enjoy shooting. Maybe it's the classic semi-pistol grip, the classic M1 Grand charging system, the bipod. But I think a lot of it has to do with this very, very effective compensator that these come with. It just dampens recoil so very much. And they're just cool. They're just super cool. Again, not saying it's the best, but I really like shooting FALs. I really don't mind G3s. Some people say these have a lot of recoil. I've never really noticed it. But for whatever reason, the BM59 is just kind of my favorite, and I couldn't really tell you why. Let's end this where we began, with the STG58 on the table, because we have two kind of closely connected questions, and then we're going to wrap this up, guys. First, what do I think of modern DSA receivers, specifically the cast ones? Okay, they're not as good on paper as the old forged ones. But I'll say this. Early this summer, I seriously considered keeping that SA58 lightweight carbine. The only reason I really didn't wasn't technically a military configuration, and frankly, I'm not in the mood to keep guns right now. I need to move things to cover the cabin. Story for another day, maybe a black box. But I think the internet does what it usually does. Are there issues? Sure. But by and large, DSAs seem to work fine. There were even some issues with the earlier ones, believe it or not. So I wouldn't worry. A person on the live stream asked, what do I think of that versus a Sentry receiver? No question, I'd get the DSA. And I would just try to build on it quickly. That way, if I had any issues, I'd call them. They're a small company. There's pros and cons to that. But I think if you have a real issue, they'll take care of you. But chances are you won't. And most of the issues I've read about have to do more with fitting of parts. An FAL receiver is not typically something you can just drop parts into. A little bit of file fitting is required, especially with a cast receiver. A Kunin, a Century, and yes, a modern DSA. It just takes a little time and a little patience, but I wouldn't worry too much about them. Plus, let's be honest, they're about the only game in town, so let's just roll with it. And I will end by saying their Israeli guns that they've built are fine. People own them. They seem to really like them. And finally, what FALs would I like to own? I'll be honest, I'm pretty happy with my collection. I've got the British L1A1, the Australian, and I'm very happy that I completed my Argentine lineup from Arms Corps. I've got a few fun builds like the G1, the Israeli I wanted for years until I found one. So all in all, I'm pretty darn happy. In fact, the guns that I want are pretty rare today. Let's say I won't find them, but probably the most gettable would be a nice South African R1 build. And I do kick myself for passing them up. I even had a few builds in the shop. But I kind of waited for the perfect one and it just never came along. And those R1 kits were so affordable for so long. What I would want ideally would be 100% South African R1 parts, including the barrel and the grenade plug and the furniture, including the really long buttstock. And I'd want one of the DS Arms South African lightning cut receivers. At least that's what I wanted for years, and I held out for that, didn't come across it. Now I'd probably just settle for anything on a Type 1 style receiver if I could get it. The baby poop camo, I could take it or leave it. I just mostly want South African parts. That's probably the biggest missing thing in my collection. But at the end of the day, it's just a metric FAL with just a couple of unique parts. So I'm not really willing to pay, say, $3,000 to do one, back when I used to be able to buy kits for $90. So maybe I'll get one, maybe I won't. Who knows? Another gun I'd like to have, not a Canadian C2. I really don't feel a need for that. I've got the Australian L2A1. But I would love a correct C1A1. Not a clutch together gun with British or Australian parts with some C1A1 parts like I had in the past. Pretty much an all correct Canadian gun. And if it's going to be on a DSA receiver, I want one with the thumbprint cut out for the stripper clip, the charger guide. Again, if I'm going to do a C1A1, I'm going to do it right because the devil's in the details. Who knows if I'll ever find one. Canada certainly isn't sending us parts kits. But that's one that is missing from the old collection. And finally, I'd love to have a T48 style gun, like a trials gun, or like an early M1 type gun. Just, that general pattern. But that's hard to find. I thought for years I might do one of the BGS builds, but I never could find a kit in the condition And at the end of the day, they're not that different from a G1. And I'm a pretty economical person. I'm not going to go crazy buying something, spending thousands of dollars. I'm lucky that I was able to get into FALs before prices went nuts. So I'm pretty conservative these days about what I get. Pretty happy with what I own. And that's not a bad place to be. That said, for years I've told friends and family I want one more FAL. And I just haven't quite found that final member of the family. But it'll come. It'll come. Alrighty, folks. I appreciate the questions and whatnot, the interaction, Patreon live stream. Trying to fill some holes in the original video and also correct a few minor errors like on the mags. Maybe I did a few things I forgot. If you have any more questions, leave them in the comments and I will answer them, but I've tried to be as thorough as possible. Please remember though, I can't view pictures online, so unless I've had hands-on experience with a gun or a parts kit, my knowledge may be somewhat limited. But I do the best for you, and hope this was helpful. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. Check out the original video if you haven't. And again, if you'd like to help support us, check out Patreon or participate in the live streams. With that, this is Misha. Catch you very soon.